In the winter of 1939, a war began that no one expected to last. A small northern nation stood alone against one of the largest armies in the world, the Soviet Union. Military experts predicted a quick collapse. Maps were redrawn before the first battles even ended. But what happened in the frozen forests of Finland would shock the world. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, outgunned in tanks, aircraft, and artillery, facing an enemy that stretched across continents. Yet Finland refused to fall. This was not just a war of weapons. It was a war of survival, endurance, and the brutal power of nature itself. A conflict fought in silence, snowstorms, and endless darkness. This is a hidden story behind one of history's most unexpected battles. This is the Winter War. By the late 1930s, Europe was a continent under tension. Nazi Germany had begun expanding aggressively, absorbing neighboring territories and reshaping the political landscape. The Soviet Union watched these developments with deep concern. Joseph Stalin feared that hostile forces could use nearby countries as launching points for invasion. One city in particular worried Soviet leadership, Leningrad. Located close to the Finnish border, it was vulnerable to attack. To Stalin, Finland represented both a threat and an opportunity. Negotiations began. The Soviet Union demanded Finnish territory to create a defensive buffer zone. In exchange, they offered distant land deep within Soviet territory. But Finland saw these demands as a loss of sovereignty. The Finnish government refused. Tensions escalated quickly. And on November 30th, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, Soviet forces crossed into Finland. Bombs fell on cities. Troops advanced through forests. The Winter War had begun. The Soviet invasion force was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers advanced along multiple fronts. Thousands of tanks pushed through narrow forest roads. Aircraft dominated the skies, bombing infrastructure and civilian targets. The Soviet leadership believed the conflict would be over in weeks. Finland's military was small in comparison. Their army relied heavily on reservists and volunteers. Heavy weapons were limited. Tanks were rare. Aircraft were few. But Finland had one advantage that could not be measured in numbers. They understood their land, every forest, lake, and frozen trail. And they were prepared for the brutal Arctic winter. Winter temperatures dropped below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Snow covered vast areas, turning roads into traps. Engines froze overnight. Fuel lines cracked in the cold. Soviet troops, many from warmer regions, struggled to survive the climate. Heavy equipment became difficult to move through dense forests. Large convoys were forced into narrow paths, perfect targets for ambushes. Finnish soldiers adapted to the environment naturally. They wore white camouflage that blended perfectly into the snow. They traveled silently on skis, moving faster than mechanized units. Instead of defending fixed positions, they used mobility and surprise. The forest became their shield. The cold became their ally. Finnish commanders developed a tactic called Madi. Rather than confronting entire Soviet divisions, they split enemy columns into isolated segments. Once separated, these smaller groups were surrounded and attacked repeatedly. Supply trucks were destroyed. Communication lines were cut. Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped deep in forests without reinforcements. Ambushes happened at dawn, at night, and during snowstorms. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers feared every tree line. Among the Finnish forces, snipers became legendary. One name would become infamous: Simo Häyhä, nicknamed the White Death, he used simple equipment and natural camouflage. Reports claim he eliminated over 500 enemy soldiers during the war. His presence alone became a source of fear among Soviet troops. War in the Arctic was relentless. Soldiers faced more than bullets. They faced hunger, isolation, and extreme exhaustion. Finnish units lived in hidden forest camps. Fires were carefully concealed to avoid detection. Food was limited. Sleep was rare. Soviet troops suffered severe frostbite and disease. Entire vehicles froze solid overnight. Sometimes soldiers woke to find their weapons unusable due to ice. Despite overwhelming numbers, Soviet morale began to weaken. Reports describe confusion, fear, and constant pressure from invisible attackers. Yet Soviet commanders refused to withdraw. Instead, they prepared for a massive escalation. After heavy early losses, the Soviet Union restructured its leadership. New commanders analyzed Finnish tactics and adapted their strategy. Massive artillery barges were introduced. Instead of scattered advances, Soviet forces concentrated overwhelming firepower on key defensive positions. Reinforcements arrived by the tens of thousands. Heavy tanks and fresh infantry units were deployed. The focus turned toward the Mannerheim Line, Finland's strongest defensive barrier. For weeks, artillery pounded Finnish fortifications. Explosions shook the frozen ground day and night. Gradually, Soviet forces began to break through defensive lines. By early 1940, Finland's situation had become desperate. Ammunition was running low. Soldiers were exhausted from months of constant fighting. Reinforcements from abroad never fully materialized. Facing overwhelming pressure, Finland entered peace negotiations. On March 13, 1940, the war officially ended. Finland was forced to cede significant territory to the Soviet Union. Entire communities were evacuated. More than 400,000 Finnish civilians lost their homes. The Soviet Union achieved its strategic objectives, but at a staggering cost. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Finland's casualties were far lower, but deeply felt across the nation. The Winter War became a symbol of resilience. A small nation had resisted a global superpower for months under impossible conditions. Military analysts around the world studied Finnish tactics for decades. The conflict exposed weaknesses in Soviet military leadership, lessons that would echo during World War II. But beyond strategy and statistics, the Winter War remains a human story, a story of survival in extreme environments, of ordinary soldiers facing overwhelming odds, and of a frozen battlefield where determination mattered as much as firepower. History often remembers the largest armies, but sometimes history remembers those who simply refuse to disappear. This was Behind the Timeline.